Hi, I'm Bob Canote, and on this episode of the Camp Chaos Chronicles, I'm going to start getting my buddy Old Tex ready for his extended summer vacation road trip. And truth is, this is the time of year where you should be thinking along the same lines as well. Dang it. Well, now why do I say that? Well, it's the middle of February right now, and if you're going to have a shop do the work that you need to have done prior to getting your car running this summer, probability is they're hurting a little bit for work right now and they'd love to see you coming through the door. But the fact is, most people wait until the second week of April and say, you know what, this winter isn't going to last forever, and then they call up their shop and they find that they have to take a number in the queue, and they're going to get their car back in the middle of August. So right now is when you ought to start thinking about that. If you're going to do your own work, great. Put it up on the stands and get on it. The first project I'm going to tackle is that of replacing the bushing in the front lower control arms. And this is a job that is simple, but it's not that easy. It's just a matter of, except for at one point, removing nuts and bolts and having a few tools that are necessary to do the job that are commonly found in an enthusiast's shop, and just sticking it back together again. It's the kind of project that once you've done it, it takes a car that you thought was handling pretty well and really does transform it. It gets rid of all that clunking up front. So the advantage that I have is that I've got a few spares around the place. And what I've been doing the past few days is to actually take and refurbish some of this stuff. You can see that I've got a front cross member here that is really solid. It's out of the parts car that we've been scavenging things off of for the past couple of years and recently scrapped. And what we've done is coated everything with POR 15 after removing the rust and then putting a top coat on it. So everything looks really good. And we've got the bushings installed, and this stuff is ready to go. Now this is Friday, about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm just getting started on it. My goal is to have the car back together again by the end of the day tomorrow. And having done all this work here beforehand, that's kind of a doable thing unless I come up with some sort of problem that I didn't expect along the way. What's it going to take to do this? Well, I think we need to get started, and I'll show you. Well, one of the first things you're going to want to do, in my opinion, is to get into the fender wells. First of all, remove the wheels. And then the next thing I would do is I would remove the tie rod ends from the steering arms, because it's kind of hard to do this. It's easier to do when it's firmly attached to the car than it is when you got it out and rolling it around on the ground. The other thing you're going to want to do, I believe, is to remove the caliper, unless you want to bleed the brakes, which is never a bad idea. Now the thing about that is that if you separate the caliper from the front suspension, you can't just let it hang, because that's hard on the brake lines, both the steel ones and the flexible ones. And what I've done, and I do this on all my cars, is I drill a hole in the shock absorber mount up near the top, and that gives me something that I can hang the caliper from out of the way. So I think that's an important thing to do. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to separate the steering shaft from the steering rack. One of the more fiddly jobs associated with dropping the front subframe is separating the steering rack from the steering shaft. And I don't know how clearly you're going to be able to see this, but right up there, that is the hole that contains the bolt that you need to remove or separate the universal joint from the stub coming out of the valving unit of the power steering. And the question is, are you going to have to remove the catalytic converter or maybe the oil filter in order to get a little bit of access to that. Well, the truth is you can get it removed. I don't know if I can show this, but if we go in from the side, you can see that there's enough room to get a long 1/2-inch wrench on to hold this end, and a socket on the end of a ratchet with a 1/2-inch socket on it can get at this end. The issue will be when we get this thing back together, how do we do that? There's just not a whole lot of room here. And of course, the easy option would be to remove the oil filter, because this thing right here, I mean, if you follow this all the way up, man, don't want to mess with that unless I have to. Now, the next thing we're going to do, might as well do that when I'm down here, is to separate the sway bar from the lower control arm, and that's a pretty easy job. At this point, then, we're pretty much, as far as I can think of right now, we're pretty much clear in terms of separating parts from the vehicle. We've got the front mounts right here. We've got the rear subframe mounts right there. Not a big deal, but here's the thing. You've got to support the engine at this point. You pull these things out with the engine weight still on it, the whole thing just kind of falls down. So before I touch these things, I'm going to put a support in to carry the weight of the engine. So other things you need to remove to make the job easier, in my opinion. First of all, we've got the air filter canisters, really tough to get to, motor mounts, and the power steering pump lines if you don't take these out, and also the shock absorbers, which are real easy to remove and replace, and they just are kind of a pain in the neck if you leave them hanging from the car or have them sticking up from the front subframe and try to get the holes, the studs lined up with the holes and so forth. So what I do is I just pull them out. That sort of takes that out of the equation, and it just simplifies the extraction and installation of the subframe to a degree. Anything you can do to make things easier is a good thing. Well, an unforeseen event that I didn't count on, and you got to kind of figure this into your calculus when you're looking at a project like this. Things are going to be coming up that are unexpected. In order to get to the motor mounts, I wanted to remove the power steering pump, and that made it easier to remove the lines and get at the motor mounts. Just a number of things, plus the fact that I had there was a time last year where I had a couple of times, I was at a gas station checking oil, adding a little bit, and I was distracted and I forgot to put the cap back on. And so this whole thing down here just got coated with oil. Same thing up here. So I wanted to pull the power steering pump to be able to facilitate that. Well, the problem is that on the power steering pump, you got this fitting right here. And there's the fitting goes into this. Okay, I turned that fitting and this thing came loose. Well, now what do you do? Well, this is a bracket that attaches the power steering pump to the bracket on the engine. In order to get this thing off, in order to get a backer wrench on this, you got to pull this off, which means you got to pull the bottom bolt off. And by that time, it's just kind of a big mess. So what I had to do is, first of all, take the bottom of the pump loose, take these two nuts loose, that came off, the bracket came off. I could then get a backer wrench on this and then get that fitting loose, which then enabled me to pull the power steering out of the way. But in order to do that, I had to pull the coolant recovery tank out of the way. Now, if you remember from last year, this is the coolant recovery tank that I repaired with JB Weld. All across the top here, this area here, there was a bunch of pinholes all the way across. I fixed that with JB Weld. And on the back side, you can still see the fiberglass weave right there. That was fiberglass mat, and there was a pretty big hole that allowed the JB Weld to just kind of fall into the inside of the canister. So what I did is I took some fiberglass mat and reinforced that. And we can see that there's really no sign of failure here. This has held up real well. All the JB Weld repairs have held up real well. And the fact is that this thing got blown up like a balloon a couple times this summer with the engine running a bit hot. But you notice up here that there is a failure of the paint right here. And if you look real close, you can see a pinhole. And this, while it's a hole, even when this thing was under pressure, you couldn't even see coolant coming out of here. So I wasn't losing any coolant. See right here at the corner? The same thing. You can see where the paint has been forced up away from the canister. So what I've got is a couple of pinholes here that need to be repaired. And guess what I'm going to repair them with? That's right, JB Weld. And I'm a real fan of this stuff now after this. I've been using it for years for a lot of things, but never on anything that if it fails, it's going to be a problem. So I'm a fan of this stuff. So at this point, then, we got a lot of cleaning to do. And that's fine. We got the motor mount. That's loosened up, and everything we can do up here has been done in terms of disconnection. Everything else needs to be done under the car. This is going, even with these hiccups, this is really going pretty easy. So this is the point where we put in our engine support. And what an engine support is just a very strong structure that fits across the engine compartment. The supports for the support fit inside of the rain gutters on the front fenders. And then these things right here with the hooks on the bottom, they attach to chains which pass through the front lifting lugs on the engine. And what you do then is you tighten these things up, and eventually it will take the load off of the front subframe so that you can actually remove it without this whole mess falling out of the bottom of the car, which is a possibility too horrible to contemplate. A couple of notes on using the engine support to pull the engine up from the subframe. First of all, where the chains are, really hard to see this stuff because it's so congested here. It's kind of a chore to get these chains installed. You can see the support right there. And what you want to be sure of, you can also see there's a lot of wires and vacuum hoses in this area, and you're going to have to kind of straddle those. What you don't want to do is, as you're putting tension on these chains, you don't want these wires or vacuum hoses to be trapped in between, for example, the lifting lug and the chain, and thereby cutting wires or cutting vacuum hoses. Just not something you want to do at this point. To adding problems you got to deal with later that are simply avoided. So there's that. Then how do you know that you've got it up high enough? That thing that I'm pointing the light at, that's the motor mount, and you can see a gap between the metal channel on the top and the rubber mount, and that gap indicates that the engine is coming up off the subframe. So at this point, assuming we don't have any other issues, we are ready to disconnect the sway bar, which should only take about 5 minutes. Then start thinking about dropping the subframe out. This is a good point to end this video. We've got everything detached from the subframe. We've got the engine support in. It's just a matter now of hooking onto it with a jack, extracting it, disassembling it, and see what it's going to take to fix this thing. So if you like these videos, like, subscribe, follow us on Facebook, which we actually intend to get up and running next week. And we'll see you the next time on the Camp Chaos Chronicles.